There is a garage at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where by 1914, more than 50 motorcars stood in formation behind the most powerful royal house on earth. Its centerpiece was a six-cylinder Delaunay-Belleville, built in a workshop outside Paris and named for a single customer, the Tsar of Russia, Sa Majesté le Tsar. The letters were cast into the engine itself. 9 years later, he was shot in a basement with his wife, his 4 daughters, and his only son. 10 years after that, the Soviet government sent his favorite car to the scrapyard. His name was Nicholas II. This is the story of the Delaunay-Belleville built for him that outlived him. To understand what it meant for a Russian Tsar to buy a French motorcar in 1909, you have to understand what the House of Romanov was. And the story does not begin in St. Petersburg. It begins 400 kilometers north of Lyon, in a French industrial town called Saint-Denis, where, in the workshops of a former naval boiler manufacturer, the most expensive automobile in the world was being assembled by hand. We will get there. First, the dynasty. It was not a family, it was an institution. The Romanovs had ruled Russia since 1613, when the nobleman Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was elected Tsar by an assembly of the Russian aristocracy at the end of a 15-year period of anarchy and Polish occupation known as the Time of Troubles. By the time Nicholas II came to the throne in November 1894, the dynasty had reigned for 281 years. The Russian Empire that Nicholas inherited from his father, Tsar Alexander III, was the largest country on the planet, stretching from Poland in the west to the Pacific coast in the east, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the deserts of Central Asia in the south. It spanned 11 time zones. At the Imperial census of 1897, 3 years into his reign, it contained 125 million people. By the eve of the First World War, it would contain more than 160 million, fewer than half of whom were ethnically Russian. The imperial transport that moved this Tsar through his territory was, until the very end of the 19th century, almost exclusively horse-drawn. The Russian imperial stables maintained matched teams of horses, lacquered carriages, postilions in dark uniforms, and a master of the horse with a household staff of hundreds. When the Tsar moved by rail, he traveled in a custom-built imperial train. When he traveled by water, he traveled in the imperial yacht, the Standard. The motorcar, in the first years of the new century, was a curiosity. The Russian roads were terrible, the winters were impossible. The motorcar was for European princes, for Parisian industrialists, for the wealthy idlers of the Côte d'Azur. That changed in 1905 when Prince Vladimir Nikolaevich Orlov, the head of the Tsar's military secretariat, introduced Nicholas to motoring during a drive in his own personal Delaunay-Belleville. The Tsar liked it. Within months, he ordered Orlov to purchase, for the imperial household, 2 or 3 motor cars of equivalent quality. The first one arrived at Tsarskoye Selo at the beginning of 1906. It was a Delaunay-Belleville 40 CV, a 4-cylinder triple phaeton body, painted in dark imperial maroon, with seating for 6 passengers. It cost 13,416 rubles. The Tsar drove in it almost immediately, and the carriages of the Russian imperial stables began, slowly and with great institutional reluctance, to be retired from daily use. The garage that would replace them was already being designed. The marque that built it was called Delaunay-Belleville, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was, by general consensus of the motoring press, the most luxurious motorcar manufacturer on Earth. Its origins lay in heavy industry. Around 1850, in Saint-Denis, on the northern edge of Paris, an engineer named Julien Belleville founded a firm that manufactured high-pressure marine boilers, the Belleville water tube boiler, which would go on to power warships in several European navies. In 1867, a young man named Louis Delaunay joined the firm, married Belleville's daughter, took the hyphenated family name, and eventually succeeded his father-in-law at the head of the business. In 1903, together with the 28-year-old engineer Marius Barbaroux, Louis Delaunay-Belleville founded a new venture inside the boiler company, an automobile firm. They called it the Société Anonyme des Automobiles Delaunay-Belleville. The continuity between the two businesses was visible from the first model. The Delaunay-Belleville bonnet, with its distinctive cylindrical radiator shaped like a marine boiler, became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in early European motoring. By 1909, the firm had become a favorite of European royal houses and the upper aristocracy. The Tsar of Russia drove one, so did King George I of Greece, so did King Alfonso XIII of Spain. The marque was, by then, what the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost would shortly become, the most prestigious chassis money could buy. In the spring of 1909, in response to Prince Orlov's expanded order for the Russian Imperial garage, Delaunay-Belleville produced something it had never produced before, a six-cylinder engine, the first six-cylinder motorcar engine ever built by a French manufacturer. The new car was designated the 70 CV, for 70 chevaux vapeur of horsepower. Only a handful were built. Two of the very first were ordered by Nicholas II. The factory, in tribute to its most prestigious customer, gave the new model a special designation. They called it the SMT, for Sa Majesté le Tsar, His Majesty the Tsar. They cast the three letters onto the cooling jacket of the engine itself, so that any mechanic opening the bonnet would see them. It was the most sophisticated motor car of its time. The starter was operable from the driving seat, a luxury so novel that within a year it had become the industry standard. The body was custom built by the great French carrossiers of Paris. The price ran into the equivalent of several $100,000 pre-war francs. Only the very richest customers in Europe could afford one. The Tsar could afford as many as he wanted. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov had been born on the 18th of May, 1868, at the same Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where 46 years later, the Imperial garage would house his fleet. His father, Tsar Alexander III, was a bear of a man, famously strong, conservative by instinct, and reputed to bend forks with his bare hands for entertainment at state dinners. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, was a Danish princess by birth, the sister of Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom. Nicholas grew up speaking Russian, French, English, and German. His favorite tutor, an Englishman named Charles Heath, taught him the reserved manner of an English gentleman, an attitude that would later be read by his ministers and his enemies alike as weakness. When Alexander III died unexpectedly of kidney disease on the 1st of November 1894, his 26-year-old son became Tsar of Russia. By his own admission, Nicholas was unprepared. What is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. The remark was made to his cousin and brother-in-law, the Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, in the days after his father's death. He inherited a country in flux. The empire was industrializing rapidly under the financial direction of Minister Sergei White. The Trans-Siberian Railway was under construction. The cities were filling with factory workers. Revolutionary parties were beginning to organize underground. And the Tsar, an indecisive man who preferred a quiet domestic life to the conduct of government, was discovering that he was not equal to the moment. In November of 1894, 3 weeks after his accession, he married Princess Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, who converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. The marriage was a love match. Between 1895 and 1904, the couple had 4 daughters in succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And finally, on the 12th of August, 1904, a son. They named him Alexei, after the 17th century Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich. He was the heir to the throne. He was also a hemophiliac, the disease inherited from Alexandra's grandmother, Queen Victoria. The family lived almost exclusively at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, 24 kilometers south of the capital. The grand balls at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg gradually ceased after 1903. The imperial family, increasingly isolated from court society, lived in their suburban palace as a quiet, devout, and unusually private household. And in 1905, in that quiet household, the Imperial garage was born. If you find stories like this, of money, machines, and the men who owned both worth your time, take a moment to subscribe to the Royal Garage. The catalog is just opening. Now back to Tsarskoye Selo. The Imperial personal garages were established in 1905 by direct order of Nicholas II at Tsarskoye Selo and at Peterhof. By the end of 1906, 6 motorcars stood in service in the Tsarskoye Selo garage. The combined annual operating cost ran to 100,000 rubles, the equivalent in modern money of approximately 1 million United States dollars per year. The fleet expanded rapidly. By 1910, the Tsar had more than 20 cars. By 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the Imperial collection had grown to more than 50 motorcars distributed across 4 permanent garages: Tsarskoye Selo, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Imperial Court in Moscow, and the Southern Palace at Livadia in the Crimea. Each garage had its own dedicated staff of chauffeurs, mechanics, electricians, and apprentices. The marques in the fleet were the most prestigious in Europe and the most innovative in the world. Delaunay-Belleville was the centerpiece marque, the Tsar's documented favorite, and the Imperial garage held multiple examples, including the 1909 SMT-70CV and an updated SMT delivered in 1912. Alongside the French cars stood Mercedes-Benz of Germany, Rolls-Royce of England, Renault of France, Berliet of Lyon, De Dion Bouton, Hispano-Suiza of Spain, and the Russian-built Russo-Balt, the Imperial garage's gesture toward domestic industry. The car the Tsar drove most often was a 1906 Delaunay-Belleville 40 CV Phaeton with a triple row of seats, a convertible top, and 45 horsepower under the bonnet. He drove it himself when permitted. More often, he was driven. The chauffeurs of the Imperial garage wore long, dark, double-breasted coats with peaked caps and gauntlet gloves. The uniform of the modern French chauffeur transferred almost wholesale onto the Russian Imperial household. They were paid well. They were trained by the marque agents of Paris and Stuttgart. They were, by the standards of the Imperial servants, technicians of a new kind, and the Tsar treated them, by contemporary accounts, with unusual personal warmth. The most important of them was not Russian. He was French, and he was about to invent something that would change military mobility for the rest of the century. There was, attached to the Imperial garage, a Frenchman named Adolphe Kégresse. Born in the town of Héricourt in 1879 and educated as a mechanical engineer in Montbéliard, he arrived in St. Petersburg in 1905 at the age of 26. The Tsar, by all accounts immediately impressed, appointed him almost at once to the position of technical director of his Imperial Majesty's own garage, making a French commoner one of the most technically empowered servants in the Russian Imperial household. Kégresse had a problem to solve. Nicholas II was a passionate hunter. His preferred winter pursuit was wolf hunting in the deep snows of the forest around Tsarskoye Selo and his hunting estates further north. By the early 19-teens, the Tsar wanted to hunt by motorcar, but the motorcars of his garage, Delaunay-Belleville, Mercedes, Renault, could not cope with the snow. The wheels sank to the running boards. The cars stuck. The hunt was over before it began. Kégresse went to work. By 1913, he had patented a solution. He removed the rear wheels of a motorcar and replaced them with a continuous, flexible track running over 2 sprockets, while attaching skis to the front wheels for steering. The vehicle, half automobile and half tractor, could now move over snow, mud, and rough ground without bogging down. The system became known as the Kégresse track. It was the first practical half-track propulsion system in the world. The Tsar tested it personally. The hunting parties resumed. By 1914, several of the cars in the Imperial garage, including, by some accounts, one of the Tsar's Delaunay-Belleville cars and an English Rolls-Royce, had been converted to the Kégresse system. The invention was a curiosity in 1913. By 1916, it was being studied by the Russian army for military application. By the 1920s and the 1930s, after the revolution had driven Kégresse back to France and into the employment of the Citroën Company, the half-track had become a standard component of European military fleets, with French, German, American, and Soviet armies all producing tracked vehicles derived in part from the work the French chauffeur had originally done to let a Russian Tsar shoot wolves from a moving car. The Tsar did not live to see any of that. He had 3 winners left. By March of 1917, the Romanov 300-year reign was over. A general strike in the capital, by then renamed Petrograd to sound less German, had paralyzed the city. The Petrograd garrison mutinied. The Duma formed a provisional government. On the 15th of March 1917, after his train was intercepted at the railway junction of Pskov, Nicholas II of Russia abdicated the throne, first in favor of his hemophiliac son Alexei, then, on second thoughts, in favor of his younger brother, the Grand Duke Michael. Michael declined to accept the crown until a constituent assembly could decide on the future of the monarchy. The constituent assembly never met. The monarchy was finished. The former Tsar and his family were placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. The Imperial garage was, by order of the provisional government, immediately nationalized. The fleet of more than 50 motorcars passed, by paper transfer, into the auto base of the provisional government. The chauffeurs and mechanics, including Adolphe Kégresse, mostly remained at their posts. The cars continued to be maintained. In August of 1917, the family was sent to the Siberian city of Tobolsk and lodged in the former governor's residence. They lived in straitened but tolerable conditions for the next 8 months. The Tobolsk townspeople were sympathetic. The guards, in many cases, were friendly. Then, in October of that same year, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government. The auto base passed to the new revolutionary regime. Lenin himself, by available accounts, took his first ride in a former Imperial motorcar on the 27th of October 1917 in a Turcat Mary of the Tsar's collection. He would, throughout the years of the Civil War and after, be driven principally in a Rolls-Royce that had once belonged to His Imperial Majesty's own garage. In April of 1918, on the orders of the new Bolshevik central government, Nicholas and Alexandra and their daughter Maria were transferred from Tobolsk to the Ural city of Ekaterinburg. The rest of the family followed on the 23rd of May. They were imprisoned in the house of a local merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. On the early morning of the 17th of July, 1918, the family and their 4 remaining attendants, including the family physician, Dr. Evgeny Botkin, were taken into the basement of the Ipatiev house. The deputy head of the local secret police, Yakov Yurovsky, announced that the Ural Soviet had decided to execute them. The firing squad of 12 men opened fire. The shooting went on for some minutes. Some of the daughters were stabbed afterwards with bayonets. Nicholas II of Russia was dead at the age of 50, along with his wife, his 5 children, and 4 loyal servants. The cars were 1,000 miles away, still in service to the new government. The fate of the Imperial garage was the fate of the empire that had paid for it. The Bolshevik regime kept the cars in service through the Russian Civil War, which ran from the summer of 1918 to the end of 1921. The Rolls-Royces ferried Lenin between his Kremlin office and his country dacha. The Russo-Balts carried party officials. The Mercedes were assigned to the Cheka, the new secret police. The Delaunay-Belleville cars, including the SMT, continued in occasional service. By the early 1920s, the cars were aging. Replacement parts were not available. The French and German factories that had built them were no longer doing business with revolutionary Russia. The chauffeurs and mechanics who had kept them running, men trained personally by the marque agents of Saint Denis and Stuttgart, had begun to drift away. Adolphe Kégresse left Russia in 1919 and returned to France, where he was hired by the Citroën Company in Paris and spent the next 2 decades developing half-track vehicles for civilian, military, and exploration use, including the Citroën Croisière Noire expedition that drove 8 half-tracks across the Sahara from October 1924 to June 1925, and the Croisière Jeanne expedition that linked Beirut to Beijing across Central Asia from April 1931 to February 1932. The most luxurious motorcar in the Imperial collection, the original Delaunay-Belleville SMT-70 CV, ordered by Prince Orlov for the Tsar in 1909, with the 3 letters of Sa Majesté le Tsar cast onto the cooling jacket of its engine, was scrapped by order of the Soviet government in 1928, 10 years and 1 day after its commissioner was shot in a basement. The Delaunay-Belleville company itself outlived its most famous customer by 30 years. The Saint-Denis factory produced motor cars until 1948, when, weakened by 2 world wars and by the death of the European market for very expensive cars, it shut down. The marque is gone. There's a museum exhibition that opens from time to time in Moscow, at the All-Russian Exhibition Center in the pavilion known as the Special Purpose Garage, which gathers what survives: a handful of Russo-Balts, a de Dion Bouton, a Renault, a Rolls-Royce or two, a photograph album of more than 100 images drawn from the archive of His Imperial Majesty's own garage, showing the Tsar in his cars, his daughters on the running boards, the chauffeurs in formation, the empty seats waiting for a family that would never return to them. The Delaunay-Belleville SMT is not in that exhibition. It does not exist. What outlived the Tsar was not the car itself, it was the model name, Sa Majesté le Tsar, cast into the historical record of pre-war French motoring. It was the engineering work of his French chauffeur, who turned a Tsar's hunting whim into a track system that the world's armies would use for the next 50 years. It was the photographs which show the most powerful man in the world standing beside a French motorcar, his daughters laughing in the back seat, the Russian summer of 1913 still visible behind them. The garage at Tsarskoye Selo, where for a brief decade the most luxurious motorcar in Europe stood, in formation behind the most powerful royal house on earth, is silent now. The Tsar is gone, the Tsarina is gone, the 4 daughters are gone, the hemophiliac son is gone, the empire is gone. The car that bore the Tsar's name went to the scrapyard 10 years after he did. What survives is the name, the photographs, and the chauffeur's invention.